Princess Anne has just revealed devastating royal news following a secret emergency meeting at Windsor Castle. With King Charles and Prince William by her side, the Princess Royal delivered a stark truth the palace had long kept hidden. No press, no spin, just the raw reality that will now change the monarchy forever. The moment Anne walked out, a royal silence shattered. 11:22 a.m. The gates of Windsor Castle shifted open, but there was no procession, no royal motorcade, just a single door, and then Princess Anne, alone. She didn't speak. She didn't look at the press. But something in her face said what no statement could. Her expression was not the public stoicism we've come to expect. It was something sharper, heavier, controlled devastation, held in the way only someone born into duty could manage. Inside the walls, a 4-hour emergency royal meeting had just ended. The meeting had been called without precedent, without public notice, media staging, or ceremonial choreography. And when it ended, there was no palisade to issue a statement, no Buckingham Palace press office on standby, no prepared wording for the public to absorb. There was only Anne, stepping out first. Eyewitnesses standing by the gates said it plainly. Something terrible has happened. She didn't need to say it. We saw it. The Princess Royal, known for her bluntness and unshakable commitment to privacy, had just been made the face of a truth the monarchy could no longer conceal. But it wasn't a role she asked for. It was one she had been chosen to fulfill. Behind her silence was a decision made not out of strategy, but necessity. A truth that had long been held behind palace doors was now too great to bear in secret. This moment marked a line in time, before and after the reckoning. And as Anne stepped into daylight, the burden she carried wasn't personal grief alone. It was constitutional weight, handed to her in a room where only 3 people sat: King Charles, Prince William, and Anne herself. What had been discussed inside was never meant to happen in this way, at this time. But it did. And Anne, the most disciplined of them all, was the one to carry it forward. The monarchy had been silent. Now, that silence had shattered. And what was said inside Windsor Castle would explain everything. The meeting that shook the monarchy. The summons went out without ceremony. There were no subject lines, no explanations, just one instruction: Windsor at dawn. Vehicles arrived separately, unmarked, unseen. No public-facing staff were notified. There were no advisors in the corridors, no note-takers, no folders on the table. What took place inside was not administration, it was reckoning. The only 3 present: King Charles, Prince William, and Princess Anne. Everyone else, excluded. Inside the room, the tone was not tense. It was stripped. Words were careful. Movement was slow. This wasn't panic. This was the weight of knowing the moment had come. According to one source, what began as a briefing quickly escalated into something irreversible. What had been postponed for months was now on the table. Truth that could no longer be buried under hope. There were no royal press teams, no public affairs officers, no outside ears. What was said would never be printed in any official release. But it would be felt in every household, every paper, every corner of the Commonwealth. Charles sat at the head of the table, aged not by time, but by the decision before him. William spoke little. Anne, when she finally did, cut through the fog. This was not a meeting to craft response. This was the meeting that forced reality into the open. As the minutes passed, One question grew louder in the room, unspoken but undeniable. Who would carry this truth forward? Who could? And by the end, the answer was not debated. It was accepted. She would be the one. And what forced that decision was what they had received the night before, a document that turned privacy into potential deception. The information that ended deliberation. The night before the emergency meeting, final medical documentation was delivered to senior members of the royal family. Not a warning, not a pending evaluation, a clinical conclusion. It confirmed what many had feared but dared not say. A senior royal's condition, unrecoverable, not stabilizing, not declining, irreversibly deteriorating. The diagnosis didn't just change the family's private reality, it changed constitutional continuity. The affected individual held not only a symbolic role, but an active functional presence within the monarchy's public and diplomatic structure. For months, updates had been filtered internally. There had been brief optimism, guarded progress, and quiet reviews. But now, everything converged. Every cautious pause, every unspoken update had been eclipsed by one conclusion: no hope, no return, no recovery. This was no longer about health. It was about succession, trust, and timing. The palace had been silent, hoping privacy would protect dignity. But silence, now, had become something else: deception by omission. The weight of this shift was immediate. According to one official close to the family, this wasn't just personal grief. This was a constitutional rupture. They knew it, and they had hours to decide how to face it. Within the meeting, Anne argued the cost of silence had already begun. Public speculation had turned from concern into suspicion. If they waited any longer, they wouldn't just lose control, they would lose credibility. And that's when the decision was made. Not to consult, not to delay, to speak. And only one voice could speak for the family, with enough weight to be trusted and enough clarity to be believed. The Princess Royal didn't volunteer. She accepted. And that acceptance, delivered without ego or hesitation, was the moment the family stopped protecting itself and started facing what lay ahead. Princess Anne breaks the deadlock. The question had been hovering in the room long before it was spoken. King Charles finally gave it voice, quietly, almost reluctantly. Is silence still an option? For a moment, no one answered. The weight of the question sat heavily between the three of them, pressing against years of habit, tradition, and fear. Silence had always been the monarchy's shield. But now, it had begun to feel like something else entirely. It was Princess Anne who responded, not with emotion, but with certainty. "No," she said, "it's already causing harm." Her words landed with finality. Anne did not raise her voice. She did not appeal to sentiment. She spoke as someone who understood institutions from the inside, how they survive and how they fail. She reminded them that history rarely condemns those who face tragedy, but it never forgives those who hide it. Institutions aren't judged for grief, she said. They're judged for concealment. The shift in the room was immediate. What had been a debate turned into a reckoning. Prince William, who had remained largely silent, felt the consequences crystallize in real time. This was no longer a future problem. This was now. Every decision made in this hour would define not just his reign, but his moral authority before it even began. Anne was firm. This was not about protecting reputations or managing optics. This was about moral clarity. She made it clear that delay would not soften the truth. It would rot it. "We are past strategy," she said. "This is about responsibility." She argued that controlled honesty was no longer optional. The public, already sensing something was wrong, would not accept another layer of silence. If the family waited, they wouldn't be choosing privacy. They would be choosing distortion. Charles listened, visibly torn. He had lived his entire life under the weight of duty, taught that discretion was service. But Anne's argument was surgical. She framed the issue not as a personal failing, but as an institutional risk. The longer the truth stayed hidden, the more corrosive it became to trust, to continuity, to legitimacy itself. Finally, the deadlock broke, not with consensus, but with acceptance. Anne would speak, not as a strategist, not as a messenger softened by ceremony, but as a senior royal whose credibility came from blunt honesty and a lifetime of service without illusion. There would be no press choreography, no advance briefings, no comforting language designed to delay reality. Anne insisted on one condition: the words must reflect exactly what was known, and nothing more. In that moment, the family crossed an invisible line. They stopped managing perception and began confronting consequence. And with that decision made, attention turned to what had brought them there in the first place. The truth they had been avoiding for months. What the family had been hiding. The medical reality had not arrived suddenly. For months, assessments had been ongoing, carefully compartmentalized, quietly updated, deliberately restricted. Each new report carried a fragile hope that time might still soften the outcome. But hope had slowly become habit, and habit had become delay. The affected individual was no peripheral figure. This was a senior royal, someone whose presence carried both symbolic weight and functional responsibility. Their role touched diplomacy, continuity, and public confidence. To acknowledge their decline was not just personal, it was structural. Earlier updates had been framed as caution. Doctors spoke in measured language. Prognoses were left open-ended. The family chose restraint, believing privacy would preserve dignity. But as the assessments continued, the language sharpened. The margins disappeared. What remained was inevitability. The final diagnosis stripped away all ambiguity. The outcome was no longer uncertain. Only the timeline remained unknown. This was the point Anne focused on. She requested a full internal review of how the information had been handled, not to assign blame, but to ensure accuracy. Every previous statement, every public appearance, every omission was weighed against what the family had known privately at the time. The conclusion was uncomfortable. What had once been justified as caution now risked being seen as withholding. Silence had outlived its purpose. Within the meeting, Anne was direct. "False hope doesn't protect anyone," she said. "It delays acceptance and damages trust." William absorbed this quietly. For him, the realization was sharp. The monarchy he was preparing to inherit was being tested not by scandal, but by truth delayed too long. Charles, too, understood the implication. The longer the family waited, the more the narrative would slip beyond their control. Public trust, once fractured, is not easily repaired. By the end of the discussion, it was clear that the hiding, intentional or not, could not continue. The family would not speculate. They would not dramatize. But they would acknowledge reality. Anne insisted the statement must reflect certainty, not comfort. No timelines that could shift, no promises that could unravel, just facts, delivered with restraint. The hiding had not been malicious. But intention no longer mattered. Impact did. And with that realization, the focus shifted to the person who would be most affected by what came next. Not the one whose health had declined, but the one whose future was accelerating toward him. William faces the unthinkable. When the meeting ended, Prince William did not return to routine. He withdrew. Not out of avoidance, but necessity. What had once been theoretical, distant, abstract, had become immediate. Succession was no longer a matter of someday. It was approaching with uncomfortable speed. William was not shaken by surprise. He was shaken by proximity. The role he had spent years preparing for, carefully, patiently, was no longer waiting for him at the far end of time. It was moving closer, reshaping itself around loss. In a private moment with his father, William asked the question that lingered between them. Did we wait too long to say something?
Charles had no answer.
The silence that followed was heavier than any response. It carried the weight of hindsight and the recognition that leadership is often judged not by intent, but by timing. Anne's words echoed in William's mind. Avoidance is not compassion, it's corrosion in disguise. For William, the realization was sobering. The crown he might soon wear would not arrive through celebration, but through reckoning. His first test as a future king would not be policy or pageantry, but trust. He understood now that the monarchy's survival depended less on tradition than on credibility, and credibility demanded honesty, even when it hurt. After the meeting, William chose seclusion, not to retreat, but to recalibrate. He knew every step forward would now be measured differently. Every appearance, every silence, every word would be read through the lens of what the family had chosen to reveal, and when. The theoretical had ended. The personal had begun. And as William confronted the unthinkable, the palace itself began to shift, quietly preparing for consequences that could no longer be postponed. The fallout behind closed doors. Once the meeting ended, Windsor Castle fell into a different kind of silence. Not absence, but preparation. The staff didn't speak of what had happened. They didn't need to. Something had shifted. The hallways, once filled with routine, were now heavy with readiness. Royal protocols began to change behind the scenes. Quietly. Efficiently. There were no new announcements, no schedules posted, but movement signaled momentum. Long-standing operational charts were updated. Contingency files, long untouched, were re-examined. A new layer of clearance was applied to everything relating to the affected senior royal. Across private corridors, the atmosphere thinned. Conversations became shorter, glances sharper. Staff members who had worked in the palace for decades noted the change instantly. One insider said, "You can feel it. Everything is slowing down, but nothing is pausing. It's like we're rehearsing for something that's already happening." Inside the family itself, new fractures began to emerge. Not from disloyalty, but from generational difference. Senior royals from the Queen's generation remained firm in their instinct for discretion. They argued that the public must be shielded, not overwhelmed. That grief must never become spectacle. That silence, in its own way, was a form of reverence. But the younger generation, led quietly by William and Anne, saw it differently. To them, concealment no longer protected the institution. It compromised it. And if the monarchy wanted to preserve its future, it could not continue pretending that privacy and silence were the same thing. Anne, recognizing the divide, acted decisively. She called a second closed meeting, this time including family members who had not attended the first. There was no room for debate, She laid down the direction with royal authority that few ever challenge. Her words were blunt. Disagreement isn't disloyalty, but contradiction will destroy trust. This family must speak with one voice. Every member of the family was told to stand behind the forthcoming statement. No adjustments, no background spin, no personal versions for the press. What came next would not be easy, but Anne made it clear. This was no longer about personal comfort. It was about national trust. And in the hours that followed, the statement, unfiltered, unsoftened, was prepared. The statement that shook a nation. Princess Anne refused to let the palace follow its usual script. There would be no press briefings, no whispered advance to favored journalists, no shaping of headlines before the truth was spoken. The message would arrive whole and unfiltered, or it would not arrive at all. The official statement, drafted under Anne's direction and approved by Charles and William without edit, was delivered without flourish. It appeared on the royal family's website, on official social media, and in a single envelope hand-delivered to press offices. It was brief, deliberately so. There was no emotional language, no metaphors, no vague reassurances about strength, resilience, or unity. Anne had insisted the statement do only one thing: tell the truth. The key line read, "Circumstances have progressed beyond expectation. We speak today because silence no longer serves." There were no timelines given, no updates promised, no medical specifics. Just one unmistakable message. The royal family had crossed into a new reality, and the public was now invited into it. Reaction across the UK and globally was immediate. For many, the starkness of the statement was unsettling, but that discomfort quickly gave way to a very different response: respect. It was clear the palace was not protecting itself anymore. It wasn't managing public mood. It was acknowledging what had already been sensed, that something grave was unfolding. And for the first time in years, the monarchy had spoken without artifice. One newspaper headline the next morning read simply, "They set it straight. Finally." There were no follow-up interviews, no clarifications. Anne had instructed all members of the royal family to go silent. There would be no commentary, no reshaping, no performance. As one former court correspondent put it, she didn't just speak, she ended the dance. There's no going back from this kind of honesty. And within the palace, a new reality settled in, not chaos, not crisis, but clarity. The day after truth. The day after Anne's statement, the palace entered unfamiliar terrain. Not grief, not yet, but something close to institutional stillness. The kind that arrives when everything that can be said has been said, and only consequence remains. There were no royal appearances. King Charles remained in seclusion, not as a gesture, but because he understood the gravity of what had just been released. His silence, Vermamitu's silence for once, was not avoidance. It was presence. Prince William, by contrast, increased his behind-the-scenes presence. Meetings, calls, preparations. He had already begun the quiet shift from supporter to successor. Those watching closely saw it. The way his posture changed. How he lingered longer at briefings. He had stepped forward, even without a formal role change. Catherine maintained the protective wall around the children. No school statements were made, but staff understood the situation had changed. Privacy wasn't requested. It was enforced by atmosphere alone. Anne declined all interview requests. One insider asked if she might consider a follow-up for clarity. Her answer was sharp but measured. Truth does not need repetition, to retain meaning. There was no damage control because there was nothing to correct. The statement had been complete in its restraint. The silence that followed was not absence. It was part of the message. Across the press, headlines didn't compete. There was no frenzy, just shared stillness. Commentators, unused to such directness from the Crown, responded with an unusual tone, respect, edged with sadness, and a recognition that something old had ended. What began as a quiet meeting had now reshaped the monarchy's public presence, not with scandal, but with truth that refused to wear a mask. The household moved into a new phase, less controlled, more grounded. There was no ceremony, but everyone knew they were preparing. And in that silence, one thing was clear. The monarchy had not collapsed. It had evolved. The reckoning had not come through confrontation, but through clarity delivered by the only royal willing to speak without filter. And that reckoning was now irreversible. A precedent that cannot be undone. What began in silence did not end in collapse. It ended in something far more enduring: precedent. With Princess Anne's statement, the monarchy had not just addressed a private tragedy, it had altered the standard for royal accountability. The public had not demanded this moment. It arrived uninvited. And yet, it delivered what no poll or editorial could: clarity without theater. Inside the palace, it marked the beginning of a cultural shift, one that couldn't be reversed. The default posture of protection, privacy, and performative strength had been exposed as outdated, even harmful. For decades, the monarchy had survived on control, but now it was regaining trust through something radically different: transparency. Public trust, once threadbare and fragile, began to recalibrate. Not because people pitied the royals, but because they recognized the cost of telling the truth. For the first time in recent memory, the monarchy had spoken plainly. It had looked its own mortality in the eye and chosen not to spin it, but to own it. Across Britain, there were no street vigils, no forced shows of national unity. What came instead was something quieter, but more lasting: respect. In private, the family shifted as well. Grief would come, but not before responsibility. The focus moved from managing appearances to accepting reality. The internal meetings that followed were not about delaying change. They were about preparing for it. Within the inner circle, one figure remained unchanged. Anne refused all follow-ups. She did not brief aides. She issued no clarifications. She allowed the statement to stand alone. One palace staffer put it best: she made her point, and she walked away from the echo. Charles, now facing a monarchy shaped more by vulnerability than tradition, chose stillness over control. He did not rush to reclaim the narrative. He allowed the truth to settle. For a man long criticized for overthinking public image, this restraint was a turning point. William, quietly stepping into greater prominence, carried the weight differently. Those close to him say he understood instinctively what this moment required: not reaction, but readiness. His reign, when it comes, will begin not with celebration, but with a legacy already shaped by candor. As for the monarchy itself, it did not fall. It did not fracture. It simply stood still and let the truth pass through it. And in doing so, it proved something Anne had argued all along. It is not vulnerability that weakens institutions, it is dishonesty. This tragedy did not begin with Anne's words, but its reckoning did. And now, the line between silence and truth has been redrawn. not by a public campaign, not by scandal, but by the single royal who spoke when it mattered most. That line will remain. A precedent once set cannot be undone. This wasn't a scheduled announcement. It was a line crossed in history. By speaking when others stayed silent, Princess Anne redefined royal responsibility. The monarchy didn't break under pressure. It evolved through truth. And from this moment forward, no royal silence will carry the same weight. The reckoning has begun, and it cannot be undone.